welcome to this week's Faith in Focus. This week we're going to talk a little bit about Daniel, and we're going to go to the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verses 10, 16, and 18. Many of you may actually know this particular passage. It is about Daniel in the lion's den. And let's get right into it. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Verse 16. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And verse 18. Then the king went to the palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. So first, what I would do is I would encourage you to not just read these 3 passages, but to go back and actually read the entire chapter to give a better understanding. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of context here. So we're in a situation where Daniel had found favor. Now, Daniel was an outsider. By all intents purposes, he was a foreigner in this particular land, and he served a different God. Okay, he didn't serve the pagan gods. And so King Darius, who was the king at the time, had 120 princesses. So let's just look at these individuals as directors or managers if we were to put an org chart together. And over these 120 directors, there were 3 VPs, and Daniel was one of those 3 VPs. Now, Daniel had found favor with King Darius, and Darius was looking to promote Daniel from VP to COO. So that meant that everyone, the 120 directors and the 3 VPs, would be reporting to Daniel. So now, of course, when situations like this happen, people oftentimes have issues. And so in this particular situation, Daniel had favor, and people had issues with Daniel. But the reason Daniel had favor was because of his character, was because of his integrity, and it was because, most importantly, he did what God instructed him to do. Okay? And this is demonstrated in the passage where it says that after the law was signed, Daniel went with his windows open and continued doing what he was doing. Now, the law came into play because these managers, directors had issue with Daniel getting ready to be promoted above them. So they came together and they said, how can we hold him back? How can we hinder him? And they got the king to write this law, put this law in place. And the law said for the next 30 days that no one could petition any other God, that anybody that they petition or pray to, it had to be the king. And so the king signed this decree. Now, after the king signed this decree, Daniel, knowing that this law was put in place, Daniel did what Daniel always did. He was his authentic and unapologetic self. He went home and he prayed 3 times because that's what he always did. He prayed 3 times every day with his windows open, and he continued to do this. And so the gentleman that had come together to put this law in place came, saw him breaking the law, went back to the king and said, hey, you put this law in place, and you said that if anybody petitions any other God other than you, over the next 30 days, they were going to be thrown into the lion's den, correct? And the king said, yes, correct. And so they said, well, Daniel broke this law. We saw him. So now you have to throw Daniel into the lion's den. And that's how we get to the point of Daniel being in the lion's den. So for me, when I began to read this passage and get clarity and just look at it from different aspects, these three scriptures stood out for me. Verse 10, verse 16, and verse 18. And in looking at these scriptures, I started to think about the tension that we face in the middle. It's not when we're at point A and God tells us something or shows us something, or point C when it comes to pass, but it's at point B when we're in the middle between what He's shown us, what He's asked us to do, and completing the task, or getting us to the promise. And so I started to think about that point in the middle. And the reason I said it's tense, it's because it's uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable space to be in. It's like you're being obedient and you're doing what you're supposed to do, yet the immediate results of what you're doing, instead of looking like a promotion, it looks like punishment. Has anybody ever been in that place where God is telling you to do something and you're trying to be obedient, and in the midst of being obedient, you feel like you're being punished versus being promoted? I have. And so what this text shows us is it shows us that in Daniel, that God will deliver you from the place that is designed to devour you when you are in position that He's placed you, or when you are in His will. God protects you, right? So it's like this situation with Daniel. Daniel practiced his faith over the law. And as a result of him practicing his faith over the law, he was sentenced to the lion's den, right? So, yes, we talked about God delivers you from the place destined to devour you. But let's talk about what it feels like being in that place, because the scripture kind of skims over it. It doesn't really describe what Daniel must have felt like being at point B trying to get to point C after he's left point A. He's gotten the instruction. He's gotten what the outcome is supposed to be. But right now, at point B, he's being thrown in the lion's den, where it's dark, where he's isolated, it's lonely, it's probably cold because it's made up of rocks like a cave, and he's surrounded by predators. He's not surrounded by, he's not even just thrown in the pit by itself. He's thrown in a pit where he's surrounded by predators. This was designed for the lions to devour him. And the king, instead of sending him during the day, he waited to nightfall. So even though he thought he was laboring or taking his time with the process, he put Daniel in a situation where it was completely dark, where there was no light. And that's how it often feels when God tells you to do something and you run into that tension and you find yourself asking, God, why? I don't understand. I know you told me to do this, but in doing this, why exactly is this happening? See, the Bible tells us about Daniel's victory, that he was released without being harmed. But the Bible also shows us that the very person that put Daniel in the den was the very person that was interceding on his behalf. And Daniel had no idea. Daniel had no idea that the king that put him in, the king that didn't worship his God, spent the night fasting on his behalf and had the faith that despite everything that was being done, that God was going to deliver him. And why? Because he said, the God that you continuously serve. So it wasn't like he just saw Daniel serve Christ once. He saw Daniel continuously serving God. So people watch what we do. People watch us. So in a situation with Daniel, God could have immediately rescued him from this uncomfortable position, this dark place where it's cold and he's lonely and he is in isolation, surrounded by his predators. God could have immediately rescued him, but God did. And not because he couldn't, but God didn't because people were watching. And sometimes God leaves us in particular places and positions so that people can see. People can see him in the midst of it. But God also puts us in these places so that we can build our character. We can develop connection. Because God isn't subject to the laws of the land. The laws of the land are subject to his authority. And so in this passage with Daniel, what he shows us is that despite Daniel's position, despite everything that's going on, God doesn't exempt Daniel from the environment. He makes Daniel go to a place that's uncomfortable. But what he does is he changes the atmosphere. He didn't change the law. That's not what he does. But what he did was he conformed the atmosphere. The atmosphere was subject to God's authority. So even though he put him in this uncomfortable place, he made it comfortable enough for him to be protected. And he provided intercession from him, from an unknowing source. The other thing about this text, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, we talked about the king wrote this law. So there's a lot of different laws in the Bible. And the king wrote this particular law. But even though the king wrote this law, he couldn't stop Daniel from going into the lion's den. He had the authority to create the law. He had the authority to put Daniel in the lion's den. But he didn't have the authority. He didn't have the authority to save Daniel from going into the lion's den. And so we have two different systems at work. We have the king's dilemma of I've created this law, And now that I've created this law, I have to follow this law. And then we have God's advantage here. Because God didn't need to change the law in order to save Daniel's life. Like I said, he simply changed the nature of the lions. It's the lion's nature to devour its prey. But he didn't change the king's law. He changed the lions. He changed the thing that was designed to destroy Daniel. And so sometimes we go up against things that are ritualistic, that people do because it's what we were told to do. It's what has been done for generations. It's what we think is right. It's because we're supposed to act. It's because how we're supposed to look. And see, that's man's system. See, the human system has limits, but the divine system of God has no limits. And that's why God said, I don't have to touch your law. What I'll do is I'm going to show you that are watching. Instead of touching the law, I'm going to go in and change the nature of this thing. And as a result of God changing the nature of the lions, the king came through in the next morning calling out to Daniel. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. Hey, Daniel, did your God save you? Did your God deliver you? And Daniel cries out and says, yes, my God delivered me. And so what does that do? For the king turns around and takes this whole pagan nation, and he turns around and he writes another decree, and he says that in this land, in the domain in which is under me, everyone has to serve the God of Daniel. So Daniel didn't know that being in the lion's den was going to be the thing that changed a nation. So sometimes that tension we're in is the very thing that God uses. And it may not be comfortable for us. And we may not understand what's going on, but because God understands the ending from the beginning, and because man's law is not God's law, we just got to keep on being like Daniel and being obedient to what God is telling us to do, because people are watching, whether you realize it or not. It's like having a purpose versus the plan. Joseph had a purpose, and God had a plan for him. But when Joseph got put into the pit, it was as if that was the end of his dream. But God still had a plan and a purpose for him. So it wasn't the end of his dream. But then Joseph got thrown into prison. And so for Joseph, it probably felt like, this is my reward for walking in integrity. This is my reward for not sleeping with the woman who was trying to entice me. Because of my character, because of my integrity, because of my obedience to God, I didn't do any of that. And my reward was to be thrown in a prison. But see, that's the thing. When Joseph got to the palace, Joseph realized that everything that he had went through between point A and point C, that tension in the middle was just logistics. So why am I saying that? I'm saying that because I even have to remind myself sometimes that I have to stand on what God has told me to do. And I have to stand on what God has shown me. And even though I don't understand or can't comprehend, or I feel uncomfortable about what's going on in my life at that moment, I have to recognize that the tension there is just logistics. It's just logistics. The den, the pit, it's logistics. See, the den and the pit are often the only doors that lead to the palace. Why do I say that? I say that because Daniel went into the lion's den, and then after that, he was made the COO. He was the top man in the palace. Joseph, thrown in a pit, went to prison, established connection with someone that forgot about him. But it was because of that connection that he ended up in the palace at a time in which he was needed in order to show favor to Israel. God used him. God did exactly what he showed him in his dream. But the point B, tension. That tension in the middle. So we have to be willing and faithful enough to God that we're willing to be like the woman who had the issue of blood. Yep, I'm going back to her. Because the woman with the issue of blood, by all intents purposes, should not have been where she was. Based on the law, she was in the wrong place. She should have never been in a crowd. She should have never been in proximity to Christ. Based on the Mosaic law, the law of Moses that God gave Moses, she was unclean. And anyone she came in contact with was unclean. So the people surrounding her in the crowd were unclean. But not only were the people unclean, but because Jesus was there, Jesus should have been made unclean. But see, that's the wonderful thing when I talk about human law and divine law, is because when she touched Jesus, what happened was she created a collision between the Mosaic law, which denied her. It excluded her, and the law of grace, which healed her. So her bravery, her making a decision to get into position and proximity of Christ didn't just heal her body, but it publicly vindicated her and her faith. And it overtook the Mosaic law, which shows us that the law of grace, the law of God, being in God's will, is much more important than the Mosaic law, which filters some of us out, which is why Christ had to come. Christ had to come so that we all would be included in the law of grace, that no one would be exempt. So even though people continue to follow that law, the Mosaic laws and the rituals, don't be discouraged. If God has told you to do something, stand on his word. Do what God has told you to do, despite the tension that you feel between point A and point C. Understand that the tension is just logistics to get you to where you have to be at point C. It's building your character because people are watching. People are looking to see what God is going to do. See, being in God's will isn't always safe. And Daniel shows us that. Joseph shows us that. The woman who had an issue of blood shows us that. But it is always secure. See, Daniel was in physical danger, but spiritually he was in the safest place he could be because he was exactly where God had positioned him. So what I say to you today is to stand in your conviction, because standing in your conviction doesn't exempt you from the den or the pit or the crowd that thinks you aren't worthy enough to be in the mix. But what it does do is it changes the outcome of you being there. I hope this was a blessing to you as much as it was a blessing to me. If you like it, share it, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining, and have a blessed week.